Hi everybody, and thank you for joining us at Christian Life Church online. We're really glad you've taken time to tune in, watch, listen, and as we share God's Word with you. If you want to reach out to us at Christian Life Church, you can do it through our website at clcwinnipeg.ca. You can also give through the website. You can send in prayer requests through the website. We're in the middle of upgrading our website. We're going to have a brand new one really soon, and hope that you will keep checking back and looking at it. Also want to let you know that for the next couple of weeks, we are going to be meeting at 9:30 and at 9:45 and 11:15 for our Sunday morning services. On July the 2nd, we're going to be switching to our summer hours with just one service at 10:30. If the crowds are too large, then we're going to have to revert back to two services on Sunday morning. And of course, we always have our Ukrainian service at 2 o'clock every Sunday as well. Well, today I want to talk to you about the what and how of giving. And I'm looking at Matthew chapter 6, starting at verse 1. And here's what Jesus said. He said, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you'll have no reward for your Father who's in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they've received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees what's done in secret, he'll reward you." Now, this is a passage of Scripture as we look at Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew that we've been looking at for the last several weeks. We've been talking about what Jesus would undo. And so this is a passage of Scripture that a lot of people misunderstand and even misapply. And they do so by saying, unless my giving is completely anonymous, I won't get a reward. Some people believe that if others find out about their giving, they won't get their reward. And that wasn't really what Jesus was saying. That wasn't the point. You know, when we look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 21 to 48, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus emphasizes our inner moral righteousness. And he talks about murder, adultery, divorce, oaths, revenge, love. And those are a lot of the things where he's dealing with heart issues. You know, how do you feel about a person? You don't just not murder them. Don't speak ill of them. Don't be angry with them. When it comes to revenge, forgive people. And so he's really dealing with a lot of the heart issues as to how we conduct ourselves, the outcomes of our lives, and how we treat other people. But then when we get into Matthew chapter 6, verse 1 to 18, Jesus then kind of makes a shift, and he's dealing with things that you might call our outward acts of righteousness. And specifically, he talks about giving to the needy, he talks about prayer, and he talks about fasting. And we're going to be talking about these other issues over the next couple of weeks. But today I want to talk about giving to the needy, or just simply giving, and the outward action of that. Sometimes we treat these three particular things quite differently and apply the truth of what Jesus is teaching about them quite differently. Like, for instance, when it comes to giving, and Jesus says, don't make a big show of it. What some people do is they end up being very secretive about it. You know, nobody should know I'm giving anything. I don't I don't want anybody to see what I'm doing. I got to be really super secretive about it. But then when it comes to prayer, Jesus says, go into your closet and pray. And yet we think nothing about praying publicly. In fact, we expect it. We expect public prayers. And then Jesus is also talking about fasting. And he says, don't do it to be seen by other people. And yet churches call fasts. We tell people we're fasting. You know, we don't keep it a secret. But what Jesus is doing here is he's saying, don't do these things in such a way as to call attention to yourself, to emphasize your importance or your holiness or your spirituality, or you know, to get people to say, hey, wow, what a great person they are, you know. So when it comes to giving, I think context is really important. What Jesus is undoing here is trying to get people to stop doing things that draw attention to themselves. And so the first thing that we see here as we look at Matthew chapter 6 is simply this: give without fanfare. Jesus's basic assumption was that we give. In fact, he says in verse 2, so when you give, not if you give, he says when you give. There is this aspect of this, that giving was just an expected part of being a follower of Jesus. Now there's all kinds of changes that happen in people's lives when they come to Christ. You know, there's things that we stop doing. There may be places we don't go anymore. There may be habits that drop off of our lives. But there's also things that happen in our lives when we become followers of Christ. And one of those things is we learn how to give. If you haven't before, if you weren't a giver before, it's something that many people end up developing after they receive Christ, because they recognize that stewardship and giving is very integral to their discipleship with Jesus Christ, their being a follower of Christ. We recognize that every part of our life we surrender to Him, and that includes our material goods. And so Jesus is really clear in His instructions on how to give. He says, don't just do it so that you can be seen by others. You know, there's a local restaurant that, you know, we like to go to every so often, and it's like a Mongolian grill. They cook the food in front of you on this big grill, and they have a gong by the counter when you receive your food from the cooks. If you put money in the jar, like a tip in the jar, you're supposed to take this I don't know, like this stick or whatever, I don't know, it looks like a drumstick, and hit the gong, and everybody goes, hey, you know, and they all celebrate, you know, because they got a tip. And that was essentially what Jesus was saying not to do. Like, when you're giving, you know, don't sound the trumpet, don't hit the gong, you know, don't ring the bell and say, hey, look what I did, everybody, I gave to this poor person. Jesus is saying, don't do that. You're not doing this for the cheers. Now, what he isn't meaning here is that just because you're giving, it doesn't mean others won't see it. He's just basically saying, don't let that be the motive, being seen. Don't let that be the motive for your giving. When you're giving, you know, you're not giving with the purpose that you're going to get your name on a building. I pastored a church one time, and they'd gotten into this habit of putting plaques on everything that people had donated, you know. So, you know, Mrs. Jones gave money for the organ back in 1965, and somebody else put a picture up, and so they get a plaque on the picture donated by Mr. Smith or whoever, and the pulpit was you know, donated by Ned Flanders or someone, and the problem was you could never upgrade the pulpit or take the picture off the wall or get rid of the organ because, well, Sister so-and-so gave money for that. And so we really had to move away from this habit of, well, if you give money, you know, we're going to put your name on a plaque. That's not why you give. And Jesus is making it really clear. You're not giving to show off. You're not giving to flaunt. You're not giving to get credit. And in fact, there may be people that see that you give. They may see your generosity, but that's not your motive to give. So he says, so when you give to the needy, don't announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in a synagogue or in the streets. Well, what was a hypocrite? We oftentimes think of a hypocrite as somebody who goes to church, who acts one way in church and another way out away from church, when they're out with their buddies, so they might act all nice and holy and everything, but during the week they drink like fish and they party like animals and they curse and swear, but then they come to church and they're really good Christians. Well, that definitely is hypocritical. And there's people like that, for sure there are. But a hypocrite in the Greek in Jesus' time was actually an actor. It was someone who pretended. And an actor, as you know, pretends to be another person on stage. That's a hypocrite. And so Jesus was saying, you're not there to be an actor when you give. You're not there to be a hypocrite. Don't do that when you're giving. That's how the hypocrites act. So the point that Jesus was making is we're not here to make a show of what we give. When we do it for praise, when we do it to draw attention to ourselves, we're forfeiting our heavenly reward. Now, another misapplication of this would be that a person uses secrecy as an excuse not to give. Well, I didn't give anything in this special offering because, everybody could see me reaching into my wallet and I only had a $100 bill and I just didn't want to show off, so I didn't give anything. So I'll just keep it a secret and keep the money to myself. Well, that's a misapplication as well. The motivation of the heart to be seen, to get praise, is what Jesus is really trying to undo. Well, second point I want to make here today is that Jesus is emphasizing that giving helps to meet needs. And I say needs on purpose because the fact of the matter is there will always be needs. Giving is a continuous thing. It is always needed. It's always necessary. You might be attending a church and you said, I gave $10,000 to the building program. I gave a special offering for the building program. And so I'm done for the year. Well, the fact of the matter is, your church is still going to need to pay their salaries. They're still going to need to keep the lights on. They're still going to need to keep the heat on. They have to pay taxes. There's a lot of expenses that your local church still has, even though they have this extra need that they may be raising money for. So giving is continuous. But I do want to kind of address an issue here, and that sometimes giving fatigue can set in. And I don't know about you, but I get it. You go to a store, you want to buy a paintbrush or something, and you're paying at the till, and it's, do you want to donate $1 to such and such a cause? And I'm like, no, I don't. I came in here for a paintbrush. Or you go to get a cup of coffee. Do you want to, donate $1 to send kids to camp? And I'm like, no, I don't. I just want to pay my $2 for a cup of coffee. I don't want to spend 50% more on this cup of coffee to send kids to camp. And it can really get quite, frustrating. You turn on the radio and there's a radio-a-thon to raise money for the hospital, or a lottery for this or a lottery for that, or kids banging on your door trying to sell chocolates, or somebody banging on your door to scam you out of money to help some group that they've made up. It's easy to get just tired of giving. And then you add to that your local church. Our church needs people to give all the time. Like, there's just always expenses, always people to help, always needs. Missionaries, they need our support. And then, you know, crisis, you know, things happen in other parts of the world, and you get a letter in the mail, and Red Cross needs money, or in our fellowship, we call it Erdo, you know, they need money for food or crisis, or there's a war or a famine or a flood or whatever. How do we prevent giving fatigue? How do we just get sick of it? How do we just deal with getting sick of it? And how do we respond to that? Well, let me submit to you that the answer to your giving fatigue is not to stop giving. And you might be saying, well, you're kind of contradicting yourself here, because you just finished saying that you yourself get sick and tired of giving and getting sick and tired of getting asked to give. Yeah, I get giving fatigue like everybody else. So how do we deal with that in a constructive way? Well, I have found that one of the things that works is to actually plan your giving. So here's how we do it in our family. And just a teaching moment. You can take this for what it is. Hopefully it'll help you. So we plan our giving. There are things that we absolutely prioritize in our own personal giving. First of all, first and foremost, 10% of what we earn, and in our case, we take 10% of our gross salary, it goes right back into the ministry. So when I receive my paycheck, we immediately e-transfer back to Christian Life Church 10% of our gross income immediately. It's the first thing we do. So that's a plan. Like that is set out. That's the plan. We follow through with that plan every single week. We never talk about it. We don't discuss it. We don't, you know, debate it. We don't like, well, should we do it this month? No, it's just done. In fact, the other day I contacted my wife and I said, did we tithe yet? And her answer, she didn't say it like this, but it was almost like, well, duh. You know, like, as soon as I get the money, I tithe. And I'm like, yeah, okay, thanks. I just wanted to make sure that it had gone in. Absolutely, it went in. It's the first thing we do. We do it because of Malachi chapter 3, verse 10. And what that verse says is, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be enough room to store it. So we make that our top priority before we pay any other bills, before we do anything else with our money. We just really strongly feel that first 10% is not ours, it's God's. And we have an obligation to God to give it to Him, to be used for ministry, for His purposes. We don't see that 10% as money that we could use for clothes or for cars or for holidays or eating out. It's God's money, and it's not there for us to buy stuff with. Now, you might say, well, that's fine. Maybe you can afford to do that. Let me tell you, there's been times that we have lived from hand to mouth. There's been times when we really needed that tithe money for other things, when there was absolutely nothing left after all the bills were paid. And we were in a constant state of being broke. We were broke up until payday, and we were broke after payday, after all the bills were paid. We've gone through that. Lots of people go through that. But it never changed our conviction that that tithe belonged to God. And so we just remained faithful, and God has always met our needs. We did this when we weren't pastoring as well. I started tithing well before going into being a pastor, and there's been times that we have been out of pastoring local churches, and we continued this practice of tithing. So enough on that. Then we set other priorities in our budget. In planning our giving, we also say, okay, we're going to give X amount of dollars towards missionary support. We're going to give X amount of dollars towards our Bible college. In our case, it's Horizon College in Saskatoon. We support them every month financially. And then we like to save a percentage of our income, just save it, put it in an account, and save it so that we can use that money to meet other needs that come up through the year. So maybe there's a new missionary coming up, or there's a need for inner city, or there's something in Ukraine that's needed. Then we have some money set aside that we can use for discretionary giving. Now, I'm not saying that we're doing it right, and I'm not saying this is the only way to do it, but those are the basics for what we do, so that we don't feel guilty when we're standing at the till and somebody says, you want to give $1 for this or $1 for that. I don't feel guilty at all, because I have planned my giving, I prioritized my giving, I've thought about my giving, I prayed about my giving, and I don't feel guilty about saying no to some needs. And we should not be giving out of guilt and manipulation and shame. That is not from God. And so I don't feel guilty about saying no to certain needs, because I recognize that nobody can give to everything. That's just not possible. So that's how we deal with giving fatigue. I can walk out of a store and think nothing of it. Anyway, there will always be needs, and we can plan to meet them. We can plan to assist with them. We can plan ahead for emergencies that come up. We can plan to give. You know, when we look at the New Testament, there were believers who were genuinely impoverished. I mean, they were poor. And there's a couple of things to note when we look at the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 2, not everybody was rich. And it said of the Macedonian church that their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. I find that kind of refreshing. I mean, here's people who were really broke. You know, they were maybe going through persecution, but they were suffering. They did not have much of anything. And Paul commends them, and he says their extreme poverty, not just they didn't have a good month, these people were living in poverty. And he said of them, it welled up in rich generosity. Now, that rich generosity may not have been, you know, huge amounts of money. It may have been a very small amount of money, but that small amount of money was actually rich generosity, because it was a great sacrifice on their part. It could have been pennies, but it was rich generosity, and they were recognized for that. I think that's really awesome. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 8:14, it says, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn their plenty would supply what you need. And so there's this reciprocal relationship. You're having it good right now, you're going to help the person that's hurting. And someday you're going to be hurting, someday you're going to be in need, and they're going to be in a good position, so they'll help you. And so that was this going back and forth. And then we look at Acts chapter 4, verse 32 to 37, and it's this great story of the early church and how they helped each other out. There's this incredible sense of community and generosity and people looking after each other. In fact, it's said in the Bible that there were no needy persons among them. And so what would happen is believers would sell land, and they would bring the money from that land and put it at the apostles' feet. Other people saw it. It was a public act. And then that money would be distributed to help people that needed the money. And then it said of that group that there was nobody in need, because everybody was being provided for. So here's the deal. There will always be needs. The church will always need support. until Jesus comes. If you are part of a local church, your church is going to need support until Jesus comes back. If your church has a building, your church is always going to have building expenses. If you don't own a building, you might be paying out thousands of dollars a month in rent just for believers to get together and share and worship and hear teaching. So there will always be needs. If you have a pastor, your pastors will always need to be paid so that they can do the work of ministry. And you got to remember that when they go to the grocery store, there's not a special clergy discount. When they buy gas, when they buy a car, when they're buying car insurance, it costs them the same amount to live as everybody else in the church. And that's just the way it is. Missionaries will always need support. As the gospel goes out around the world, we're always going to need to support missions and missionaries. There will always be new mission fields opening up and new people going out to the mission field. There will always be crises in this world. Did I say that right? Crisis? There will be many crises. Well, you know what I'm talking about. There's always going to be a crisis somewhere in the world. There's always going to be widows. There's always going to be orphans. There's always going to be refugees. You'll always have the poor, Jesus said. There will always be needs. And there's different ways that our gifts behave. Some gifts behave in this way, that they keep the wheels of ministry turning. They're fuel in the tank. They're paying bills. Some of our gifts are going to be given, and those gifts are going to open new doors for ministry. Maybe open a new church in Bosnia or something like that. There will always be ways that those gifts behave. Some gifts are going to behave in such a way that they meet a crisis. They put food in people's bellies. They put clothes on their backs. They put a roof over their head. Some giving will actually save people's lives and meet physical needs. So our gifts behave in different ways. Third and final thing I want to talk about is give to inspire others to do the same. From time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, and they brought money from the sales and they put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to everyone as they had need. Acts chapter, I believe it's chapter 4, 34 to 35. Well, here's an example and a challenge to others in what they were doing. And I believe this was a public act. It would be seen, and it was an example, and it was a challenge to others. And it wasn't about people getting credit. It was about people celebrating God's provision and His goodness, and showing that God is making a way for people, and that Christians are caring for each other. There's genuine concern and a willingness to help. And that was an example to other people. Mature Christians should model and set an example of giving to newer Christians and to next generation believers, to newer believers. Our next generation needs to understand the gift, the grace of giving. They need to be taught that, and the best people to teach that are people that have done it for many years, mature Christians. There's a very wealthy man by the name of R.G. Letourneau. He was born in 1888, died in 1969. And he's known as the greatest inventor of earth-moving equipment. His stuff was used around the world. He was a great inventor. He was extremely wealthy. And he was known for his generosity and his giving. In fact, it is broadly known that R.G. Letourneau gave 90% of what he earned back into the Lord's work. He supported the Alliance Church, Gideon's, Christian businessmen's. He supported missions around the world. 90% of his salary and his company profits went back into the Lord's work. People's Church in Toronto, I don't know where they're at now, but for years and years, I believe it's understood that 50% of their budget went into world missions. They had a reputation for their generosity. The owner of Hobby Lobby, I just read a book by him, Leadership Not by the Book, I believe it's called. He talks about his large chain of stores in the US, and I believe they give 50% of their company profits to spreading the gospel. Now, the thing is, we know about these things. We read their testimonies. And I'm thankful that we know about these things because it challenges us. It inspires us. It teaches us. It instructs us. It gives us an example. And so Jesus wasn't saying, don't tell anybody what you're giving. He was just basically saying, don't brag about it. Like, don't be a hypocrite. Don't be a show-off. Don't make it an act. But by all means, encourage other people to follow your example in the area of giving if you're a giver. There's two men I want to honor today. This is a Father's Day Sunday. And the first man I want to honor today is my wife's dad, my father-in-law. He didn't say a lot about his giving. We just knew that he did give. He wasn't wealthy. He'd worked for the phone system. He retired at 8 years old, whatever, after 35 years or so. He lived in the same house. They owned one house, a 900 square foot bungalow, one bathroom. Lived in that little house for about 55 years. They built it as a young couple, and that was the one and only home that my in-laws shared and raised their family in. And he would not be happy about me saying what I'm about to say. In fact, if he was still alive, I wouldn't say any of this. But he's in heaven now, so he can't get to me, and I can get away with this. And he's not going to lose his reward because he would be afraid of that. But he gave. He gave 10% of his income faithfully as a tithe. Every payday he gave the Lord a tithe of his earnings according to Malachi 3:10, like his daughter and son-in-law do. And he also supported ministries and missions. When he came to the place in life where he had to sell his house and move into assisted living, his living costs went up exponentially. And he wasn't upset about the fact that he had to sell his house. He wasn't upset about the fact that he was going to be living in a much smaller place. He was upset about one thing, and it's this. He said, I'm not going to be able to give as much. I have to cut back on my giving. And it was in that period of time that we understood just how much he gave each month to support missions. In fact, we were blown away by how much he gave. And I think really his motto would probably be to live is to give. The other guy I want to honor today is my own father. I was raised in such a way that he was adamant against spoiling us as his children. So I remember when I got, my first real bike, when I was 12 years old. I mean, I'd had little other bikes when I was younger, but I wanted this particular bike. And back in those days, you could get a new bike for, I don't know, 80, 100 bucks. Well, he wanted me to get something special. And I remember my bike was actually about $160. And that was a lot of money back then. But I had to pay for half of it. And boy, I was proud of that bike. I had that bike for 30 years. When I got a motorcycle, again, I had to work and pay for it as, 12, 13-year-old kid. When I got my first car, I had to work. I had to pay for it. I had to pay my own gas, my own insurance, my own repairs. He didn't spoil us in any way, shape, or form. He wanted us to stand on our own 2 feet, and his mantra would probably have been, nobody owes you anything. So growing up, he was pretty strict about not spoiling us or giving us a sense of entitlement. But as I became an adult, I got to see the true side to my own dad. And I got to watch a man who didn't have a lot, but he would give a man on the street the shirt off his back if he had a need. He didn't pay my way through college, but when I started pastoring, I started out in a small church and they were paying $250 a month. And certainly it was not enough to live on. And my dad paid half my salary. He topped up my salary for years so that I could plant churches. And I heard stories of him giving to people who were needy. And he'd never loan somebody money. He'd say, I don't want you indebted to me, so I'll just give you the money. Don't worry about paying me back. Now, there wasn't a lot left when my dad died. But while he lived, he sought to enrich others. I saw in a man someone who was not attached to the things of this world. He valued giving, and I honor him for that. And so I want to honor these two men, my dad, Vern Poirier, and my father-in-law, Dave Wilson, and thank them publicly for the example that they set for us and for many others. And so I want to close with these words. What would Jesus undo? I think he'd undo materialism. I think he would undo earthly-minded thinking. I think he would get us to invest in other people. I think he'd have us invest in the kingdom. I think he would encourage us to be generous. I think he would undo the fear of us not having enough by teaching us to trust him and to help others and meet their needs. I thank the Lord for what he's doing in this church, how he has supplied needs, how we have just learned to say yes to different needs and sat back and watched how God just met those needs and worked through us and did the impossible. Every need was supplied. And there are still times as a church that we get called upon to help people with their rent, with groceries, with other needs. And I got to tell you, it stretches us, and sometimes it's tiring. But God is faithful. God is faithful, and I can testify to that today. And you can't outgive God. When you give, he said, when you give, he just expected it of us to be givers. Well, I really didn't think I was going to go the direction I went on the message on giving today as I did, but my hope is that it has encouraged and inspired you and helped you. Thanks for joining us. I won't talk any longer. Pick us up next week. God bless you.